All right. So as you can see, live captions have been enabled for this event. If you'd like to view the captions, you can find the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Please make sure to drop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window so they're not lost in the chat. And please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and any attendee can be removed from the event at our discretion. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's Author Event Series. My name is Silas. I'm a member of the events team here at Brookline Booksmith. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, allow us to extend you a warm virtual welcome. We're so excited that you're all here this evening to celebrate the release of Dark Heir with author C.S. Pacat in conversation with Sarah Rees Brennan. Sarah Rees Brennan is a New York Times bestselling author, award winner, and all-around veteran of the industry. Sarah has been a finalist for the Locus, Mythopoeic, and World Fantasy Awards, and long-listed for the Carnegie Medal. She is a survivor of late-stage Hodgkin's lymphoma, about which she's written various articles and continues to seek every opportunity to share her story. Born and raised in Ireland by the seashore, she now lives near a cathedral where they gave sermons on Dracula. Welcome, Sarah.
So delighted to be here.
C.S. Pacat is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of Dark Rise, the Captive Prince trilogy, and the GLAAD-nominated graphic novels Fence, as well as a writer for DC Comics. She was educated in, writes, and resides in Melbourne. Welcome, CS.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to chat with you all today.
And I'm just going to intro the book, and then we'll get started. Dark Heir is the riveting sequel to the New York Times bestselling novel Dark Rise, in which Will and his allies survived Dark's first assault, but at a terrible cost. A new threat from the past is rising, and only a handful of heroes remain to fight. Pursued by dark forces, Will and his allies must leave the safety of the Hall and travel to the heart of the ancient world, making new and dangerous alliances and revealing the shocking secrets of the past. But Will is carrying a dark secret of his own, his true identity. Drawn to the beautiful and deadly James St. Clair, Will is pulled even deeper into the web of the past and finds himself tempted by the darkness within. As the ancient world threatens to return, can Will and his friends fight their fate, or will the truths they learn tear the world apart? Here to tell us more are Sarah Rees Brennan and C.S. Pacat.
Thank you so much, Silas.
Thank you for that marvelous introduction. All right, so now I am in control of everything, as I understand it. I'm so happy to be with you all and virtually at one of my favorite bookstores, introducing one of my favorite authors. And I have many, many questions. And here's the first. First of all, how dare you? How dare you do this to everyone, but specifically to me? I knew what was coming, and yet it was so much worse than I had ever imagined. Now, I know you cannot answer this question because people will be spoiled, but I wanted to warn you all of what was coming. It is outrageous behavior. I loved it.
Oh my gosh, thanks so much, Sarah. And like before we start, I also want to say I'm so excited to be here with one of my favorite authors of all time, which is Sarah Rees Brennan. And if by any chance, because I rave about your work every chance I get, I am almost certain that everyone in the chat has already read all your books. But in case anyone hasn't, Sarah's books are so incredible. My previous favorite Sarah Rees Brennan novel was In Other Lands, which is an amazing magical school with a bisexual protagonist that I loved. But my new favorite Sarah Rees Brennan novel is a book that is coming out next year, I believe, with the incredible title Long Live Evil. If that gives you any idea how good it is, it's like even better than the title, which is so amazing. So anyway, thanks for chatting with me today, Sarah. Yeah, Sarah definitely glimpsed the book behind the scenes on quite a few occasions. So she did know what was coming. We won't
Yes,
see
it
any
wasn't.
spoilers today, but if we do venture into anything even remotely resembling spoiler territory, we'll give you all fair warning, and to be able to look away. But yes, with no spoilers, I did my best to make this book, and especially the ending of this book, even more bonkers than the ending of book one. So I hope that those of you who have read it enjoyed it.
I mean, I always think that with the trilogy, it's book one, set up, book two, make out, book three, defeat evil. And by make out, I mean interpersonal drama. And good heavens. But also, we will have plenty of time to discuss both the nature of evil and the slow burn of a romance. But one thing I wanted to talk about was your immense capacity for surprise, because I do think that is the hardest thing a writer can do, because we can make ourselves cry, sit there, we go like, oh, I'm so sad. I hope other people will also be sad. You make yourself laugh, but you can't really plan to surprise yourself. I mean, it happens. It's just, you're mostly like, oh no, this is a surprise. So that is why I think that the twist is an amazing thing. And I will say that in both your Captive Prince series and the Dark Rise series, I've managed to figure out the big overarching twist, which I think is a great sign, because you play fair and put in the breadcrumbs. But I was, as you know, totally wrong about any number of small things. I mean, we met up in last winter in London, and we were walking around, and I was prattling on about Will's mother. Boy, did I get it all wrong. Whereas we all know Will has a very mysterious heritage indeed. Our wonderful hero, anti-hero, who's to say? So I wanted you to talk a bit about planning surprises and planning small surprises, and whether that's tough for you, or how do you do it?
So my favorite type of twist is, well, I don't know if this is the official name, but I've heard Karen Joy Fowler referred to as the revelation plot. And that is the kind of twist that reveals something that backlights everything that came before, so that if you were to read it again, it would be as if with new eyes. So a twist that is not only a shock, but that changes the whole paradigm, so that you like have this change in understanding of everything leading up to the twist. So that's like my holy grail of twists. And I think a good example of that twist would probably be the end of the movie The Sixth Sense. That was like a really good one of it. I think the author Dorothy Dunnett is quite good at those twists, especially in the Niccolo series. But I don't see it done that often, and it's like, when I tried to do it myself, I realized the reason I don't see it that often is because it's like really hard to do, actually. And so not to talk to talk only about book one of Dark Rise, that does have a twist in the tail that I think changes everything that came before, or at least I hope that it does. That was, from a writing standpoint, probably the hardest twist I've had to manufacture, because I was writing two books at the same time: the actual book, what was actually happening, and the apparent book, like what the reader thought was happening. And I felt like I only had full control over the actual book, and the apparent book, like I could never be sure exactly what a naive reader was thinking or feeling. So I had to do my best to manage that. I think, like, you and I have talked before, like the greatest challenge of being a writer is, how do you subvert a reader expectation while still fulfilling it? and so like, to get into the writing weeds a little bit, I guess the way that I try to set up twists is, first of all, I try to make everyone assume there's going to be no twist. So I try and take the pressure off the twist. Nothing to see here. There's not going to be a twist. In the first book, I did that by putting a twist in the middle, and I hoped it worked as a decoy twist, so that people would think that that was the book's twist, and therefore stop expecting something to happen at the end. the second thing that I try and do is create an arc that of like that you think somewhere, a journey you think you're going to go on. So I try and like create the illusion of a path, and then like the reader has an expectation that they're going to be going somewhere and then change the direction. In Dark Heir, but the other thing is, I think like it's really important to reward the readers that guess, and that's going to be some percentage of readers no matter what you do. And I think in Dark Rise 1 it was about 20% of people. Like if I do an event, about 1 in 4 or 5 people is like, oh, I guessed the ending. And so I like to write the twist with the expectation that some people are going to know. And so in Dark Rise 1, I at least hope that there was an offering there that was satisfying for the people that knew already.
It was like a beautiful evil lasagna. It did.
Yeah, but what about you, Sarah? Because you do twists really well as well. Do you have any like tricks in the toolbox for how to?
Oh, despair. I love a twist. I love Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I love Megan Whalen Turner's The Thief. I love whenever I watch or read something and there's a small surprise, like in the new Dungeons and Dragons movie, the first scene ends with a surprise.
I jog my memory what that is. I have seen the film, but
so Chris Pine's like, where's Jonathan? I wish to like give him my speech about how everything's gonna be okay. How I really do the crime, or if I did, it wasn't that bad. And you're just like, oh yes, he's bribed the juror. Yes, he's coming. And then Jonathan comes in and is a large winged bird who can talk. And he's like, oh, Jonathan, and he just tackles him and they fall out the window. And then everyone else on the jury is like, my man, we were gonna let you go free. There was no need for this. What are you doing? And that lets you know that you're in safe hands, which is a part of why I was talking about small surprises, because if I hadn't read you before, if I was like, here's a YA book, I hear it's brilliant because everyone says it is, and they are right. When I was reading Dark Rise, I would be like, Will and Violet, yes, their love is about to be very true. I fully empathize with Violet because holy crap, look at that boy. Grab a sword. Yes, indeed. And then I was like, oh no, they're just the greatest bro TP of all time, I would say. There's one really beautiful way that Will describes Violet as his star in the night in Dark Heir, which really touched me. I love that you talk about friendship in that way. But that did make me think about archetypes and how I love a subversion, as you know. I like turn them on their like snow globes.
And you're so good at it.
Thank you. I mean, I do love to think of what will really surprise people, but sometimes I do feel like, I've gone too far. Then everyone's like, oh, we already knew that. Or with Long Live Evil, actually, I remember sending it to one of my critique partners. I was like, so is the end too obvious? And she was like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, the thing at the end. And she was like, is that what was going on? Oh, I didn't get that. And I was like, oh no, excuse me, I have to fix this. Goodbye. And I think that is partly because I am really eager to flip things, whereas you are so good at archetypes, and especially in the Dark Rise books, because there's Susan Cooper stuff, there's mythology stuff, there's can I spoil a little bit of Dark Rise? They're not Dark Heir?
I'm putting my finger up, so we're saying a little spoiler, and I'll put my fingers down when the spoiler is over. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There is just this moment, because if you are familiar with fantasy tropes, but you also like explain them to their fullest within, you're like, oh my God, the Knights Templar turn into Nazgul. And it works because you have already given us the fantasy tropes to their fullest extent. And I remember you talking about the most perfect form of an archetype. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, finding the fantasy thing in a fulfilling way.
It's such a good question. I feel like there's two parts to my answer, I think. So the first is archetypes, to me anyway, they have their own power and their own deliciousness. So there's certain archetypes that I think people most archetypes exist because they occur in stories over and over again, and the reason they do is a contingent of the audience loves them. So that could be like the asshole with the heart of gold, or it could be the butch stoic hero, a few words, or what have you. And I think an archetype is a kind of shorthand as well. So it comes with power. It brings a set of expectations, because usually an archetype has a role that they're going to do and perform in the book. And then and it comes with like love or hate from the audience, who has seen this trope play out before and already knows if they like it or not. So I think you have to respect the audience, because if you're rolling out an archetype, they're going to want it to be as perfect as possible. They really want to see the thing they love, and so you have to kind of realize that and try and bring the archetype to life as fully as possible, but give it enough flair that it's unique, a realized character, but also does come with the deliciousness and the tropes that the audience already loves. So I do really try and do that. In Dark Rise, because like part of the reason for writing this book was I wanted to tackle some of those classic texts that I grew up reading when I was younger, like Lord of the Rings, or like The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper, which my title is an allusion to. And so, you know, I love those books, but they didn't always include me. And so I did spend quite a lot of time thinking about what are archetypes I love and who have I not seen embody these archetypes before. So I'd done a sort of noble warrior archetype already before in Captive Prince, and that was Damon. And this time, you know, this book is set in England in the 1820s. It has got a lot of themes of like colonialism, and I knew that I wanted to have an Indian British character in the book. And I don't think that I see girls embody the stalwart noble warrior type that often. And so I gave that role to Violet, and already that combination between the person that's not usually allowed to be this archetype and the power of the archetype came together, I think, really well in that case. Like, I love writing her character so much. And so yeah, and then there's a few other instances in this book where then there's a case, I guess, where archetypes are like directly subverted. So Will, at least, so spoiler for Dark Rise book 1, Will at least appears as though he's just the everyman ordinary hero that we've seen 100 times before. Like, this hero is like always called Will in all these books. And then I think towards the end of the book, you find out that that is not the case, that he's something different. But actually, I did a event with Holly Black 2 days ago, and she made the excellent point that if you're going to subvert a trope or an archetype, you better make sure that the thing you do is more interesting and better than the original archetype. So I think I do try and keep that in mind as well.
I was creeping on that event, and indeed have derived questions from it. But it did make me think of you and your reaching for the most perfect form, because the thing I loved first about Will was that I thought, I mean, I knew to come. He's so good. I love him. He's so brave. No one else would have done that. And it did make it just, you have really given me a great appreciation of the fulfilled archetype that I don't think I had before you. At the same time as digging into the subversion, we were talking, you and Holly were talking about George R.R. Martin, and what you were saying made me think about a quote of his, and everyone is always quotes the first part of this thing that he says, just like, what was Aragorn's tax policy? And as someone who's written like diplomacy and fantasy lands, oh my God, I don't want to know Aragorn's tax policy. No thanks. But he's like, what about the orcs? Are you going to kill them all, even the like little orc babies and their little orc cradles? And I was like, that's a great point.
Yeah.
And that you do have to bring that to that logical conclusion, and that you play fair that way.
I think, like, you know, this book is in conversation with Lord of the Rings at all times, this series. And we're kind of talking about this the other day, but, you know, as an Australian, like we, especially when I was growing up, we just consumed so much British fantasy. And I'm not sure, I mean, I'm not sure if it's the same in Ireland, and I don't think it's the same in America. I just don't think they're in that agon with England in the same way that Australia is as like a colonial country. But you know, Tolkien just dominated our idea of what fantasy was for so long. And you know, I reread Lord of the Rings multiple times in preparation for writing this book, and there was so much of the book that I felt like was so like it Lord of the Rings fell out of fashion, I think, and people were like, oh, this old-fashioned fantasy or whatever, but there was so much that was so relevant. I remember reading that section where, you know, Frodo says to Gandalf, like, I wish I had not lived to see such times. And Gandalf says, like, that is not for us to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the times that we have. And like, you can't help but read those books and realize like Tolkien's writing them in the shadow of 2 world wars. He was very anti-war. You know, he was even against the bombings of Berlin, which he, because of its effect on the civilian German population in World War II, which is a fairly extreme position for an English person to have, pacifistic position. And he wrote in his letters, I don't think we should be doing the bombings. When we use the weapons of the enemy, we become the enemy. And so there was so much that was relevant. But yeah, all the stuff that did feel very old fashioned was that weird racial determinism where like an elf will always be good and an orc will always be bad. And it's, like you said, much more interesting to think about, like, but what if an orc could do a heroic deed? Is an orc baby destined to grow up evil? And what if an elf could betray you? Is that also possible? And so I think because, you know, so often the villain in these types of fantasies is like other or queer. Part of the reason that I wanted to write Dark Rise was to take on that question of what happens when the narrative is just telling you that you are the villain. Like, are you going to succumb to like narrative determinism and just fall to your destiny and become the evil creature that everyone sees you as? Or do you have any possibility to overcome your fate? And so yeah, I love that quote by Martin. And I think, but yeah, that's interesting, the first part of the quote about Aragorn's tax policy. Like,
I mean, I took his point. I was just like, the later part was more interesting to me, and I heard the first part quoted more. And I was like,
yeah.
Oh.
And he was the first person that I saw, because like I grew up probably same as you. Like in the 90s, there was a lot of dudes writing Tolkien-esque fantasy, like Eddings or Robert Jordan with Wheel of Time. And Martin was the first person that I felt like I saw take Tolkien on and not collapse in the face of his influence, not just be a lesser Tolkien, but like, because he was not, yeah, he's like he's like, you know, what if the past was not a pastoral bucolic fantasy and it was actually grim and brutal and chaotic? And what if the hero isn't destined to win and anyone could win? It's just a matter of circumstance. And like, so he was asking these questions about all the things that Tolkien left out. And I thought he did a really good job of that. But the things that I wanted to know that Tolkien left out was like, well, what if these narratives of good and evil aren't an exact fit to the people that you've thrown them on top of all the time? What happens when you have this simple moral framework and you're trying to fit the complexity of like human beings within that? So yeah.
Which actually brings me very neatly into the question of evil and identifying with villains, because as you say, often we have queer archetype villains. We have women who are too old, which I think means above 21. We have people with different body types. We have people who aren't conforming to traditional gender stereotypes and like presentations, which of course also change with time hugely. And because these are seen as sinister, we also grew up with Disney villains, grew up with classic British fantasy like Harry Potter. So we were all like, oh, being Irish is a lot like being Australian in that we have things that aren't ours imposed on us, but we're also like, because we're closer and we have similar climate and we've got the castles and we've also got our own legends and they're very co-opted, which is why I can read hardly any fairy aside from, of course, the beautiful Holly Black.
Very interesting.
The Irish are very skeptical, but we're also like, don't take risks. So you're just like, oh no, no fairies, no. You're like, so why are you leaving out the milk? And you're like, because insurance. Because what?
Do you
But
leave out milk?
Walk into a fairy ring.
Do you leave out milk? Do you have any traditions like that?
I don't, but when we go to the country, my uncle has a cottage and in the Ring of Kerry where there are a lot of fairy hills. Yeah, I do. We leave out the milk.
All right, yeah.
But then I'm always like, fairies are tricksters. So people are like, my fairy boyfriend is dreamy. I'm like, oh, when you try to go back home, you'll turn into a wizened crone and then die in a lake of some kind. Don't trust him.
Yeah, that's similar to my family's Italian, and we like, I'm very rational and I'm not an woo person. I don't believe in like mystical things really, but yet I know when someone's put the evil eye on me and I will do I would do the sign against the evil eye, definitely.
But yeah, the inherent humanity, or not humanity, but finding something to sympathize with in the villain, sympathy with the devil, being of the devil's party, and kind of knowing it.
Yeah.
I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about that, like growing up. Like I remember read the second Harry Potter book first, and I did have a school organized in the British way. And my house was color was green, and we were notorious for cheating. So I was just like, oh, they seem nervous. Oh, I hope they win. They never did. They never did. The underdogs can't win every time. That's ridiculous. They're not underdogs.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, Harry Potter is such an interesting case study because it's probably like the last of the classic British fantasies that was in that old-fashioned mold and that had this like dominant effect over all of the rest of fantasy for like a decade or more after it finished.
And there were subversions
have that
before.
Yeah, and it does have that simple moral framework again, where there's like a good house and an evil house, and the like as a reader, because I came to it as an adult, not as a child, I was waiting for the Slytherins to be redeemed, for them to be not homogeneously bad, but to have like some kind of like heterogeneity of morality amongst them, and it just never happened. And I think that's because it's the people who are queer or marginalized or have some kind of like non-normative physical presentation or whatever it may be, that is so often cast as villains. And like I used to yearn for these villains to show that they weren't one-dimensional, that they had another facet, that they weren't only bad. And it took me a long time to realize, like, I didn't realize when I was a kid, just, wanting Sauron to get a second chance, that I was like actually just thinking like, I want a second chance. Like, I'm not a bad person just because I'm queer. That's the mental fight that I was actually having with a lot of these narratives. Like all of
Where's the love for me? Am I being flattened into this?
Yes.
Did you have a favorite Disney villain?
Yes. Oh, my favorite Disney villain was Maleficent, which was I just had a little crush on her, I guess. But again, queer coded, just like Ursula is queer coded, and Scar and Jafar, and like all of the Disney villains. And the other thing is like those
songs are always better. Villain songs are bangers. This is just a great truth. Speaking of Holly Black, she wrote a Maleficent novel, and I was like, okay, you have to put her and Prince Philip in the dungeon. Do this for me. And she was like, why? And I was like, don't take questions.
I know why.
I
understand, Sarah. No, I understand completely. Yeah, I know. And I do think that these like archetypes of villains really linger on in the imagination for a long time. And I do think that, by the same token that it's talked a lot in queer theory about like the idea that Oscar Wilde and the Oscar Wilde trial, when he was on trial for being gay, like defined the idea of what gay was for generations, which was like effete and predatory. But by the same token, you know, in the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, like that was the era of the trans serial killer in all of media, starting with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, where like Norman Bates in a dress kills a woman in a shower. And I think, you know, well, does this have some lingering like relation to our fear of trans in a bathroom? Like, who knows? But the seminal image of a killer of who is trans, I think was really damaging. And so those villain representations, like they really matter to people. But I mean, I've said this before, but yeah, I was lucky enough that it didn't make me like hate myself or hate being queer. Much like you, it just made me love villains and want to write about them all the time. So
I'm glad for that, but I'm also glad for stories that are expanding our feeling of it, so that less and fewer people are, I hope, trapped in the boxes of hate. I will also say, of course, there was that unintended side effect because predators have power. So
yes.
unless they're doing something really awful, and even then, if it's interesting, you're like, this is cool.
Yeah.
You're like someone who can ride a dragon or a horse with a skull with like flames for eyes, who has the cool cloak, who has like the only men who can wear good eyeliner. You're like, okay, well, I love them. Someone described David Bowie once and was like, oh, he was just some guy wearing a dress, and 3 years later, he was still exactly the same guy, but everyone wanted to be like him.
Yes. Yeah, that's such a good point. And it like, especially if you haven't had much any representation, it does feel empowering to see yourself as a character with at least cool powers and a cool outfit, even if they're the villain. I think the author that reclaimed that, for me at least, like the queer villain the most effectively then was Anne Rice with Interview with the Vampire, where
evil is a point of view.
Yes, and Lestat as the sort of sadistic yet so sympathetic kind of bisexual killer that you were invited not to hate but to empathize with and be, for me was a really powerful escapist fantasy growing up.
Yeah, Interview with the Vampire was the first book where I read the first one and I loved it, and it already has great sympathy with monsters. And I was like, and the villain, the sequel is called The Villain McEvilface? What is this happening to me? And then I read the first page and I was like, marry me.
Yeah, well, again, one of my favorite like paradigm shifts in a series of understanding, where Interview with the Vampire finishes with Lestat as unequivocally the villain, and the vampire Lestat just starts with Lestat saying, don't listen to the first book, here's what I have to say about myself.
It's true, but even then, and Anne Rice, like there were 10 years between books, and she did change her mind on a lot of stuff, but even then there are grains, like in the book, and this isn't in either the movie or the show, we have Lestat's human father, and when he lies dying, he holds Lestat's hands and he says, you are the gentlest of them all. If you forgive me, God will forgive me. And the whole time he's holding someone else's hand completely, and it's all a lie. But it's amazing. And I wanted to talk about your points of view, bringing us back around to you, and how great all of your points of view are, because you've got a lot of them in Dark Rise. It really makes the world larger. And so you have things like Cyprian's point of view, and Cyprian's like, I don't think James is that good looking. And everyone else is like, strong disagree.
I think so it was my first time to write multiple points of view. It is harder than writing single POV for all the writers out there. And the more POVs, the harder it is, because everyone, when you're writing just one point of view, the story follows the character. And when you're writing multiple points of view, you have to really know what the story is and how each piece fits into a larger narrative. So it's more like a puzzle. And so, but it's very, very fun. And I think Captive Prince was such a strong single POV. And I think when you have only one viewpoint, not all readers, but many readers can confuse the viewpoint with the author or something like that. Like, oh, this is just what the narrative is telling me, and the narrative doesn't lie. So this character cannot be biased because this is an objective narrative. When you've got multiple viewpoints, it's very clear that everyone's only seeing one piece of a larger whole, and that even the writing is characterized so that the characters are seeing things differently to one another. So I like that sort of obviousness of the bias, whereas in Captive Prince, the bias was there, but it was not always obvious to everyone, and I had to work harder to make it obvious, if that makes sense.
It does, but it's so interesting because I was actually thinking that with a single point of view, it seemed a little easier to me to do the big reveals, like when you realize about Nikkei's, the first big realization about Nikkei's, and I was like, oh no, along with Damon, whereas you do surprises amazingly in Dark Rise, but I did think it looked harder because we're all living in different worlds and that we only overlap at certain points. So because you have all of that, you've got more clues to put together and more things people know. So I would wonder if you found that.
Yeah, definitely. And I learned a lot. I like apologize to the viewers if this is getting too technical, but I learned a lot again from George R. R. Martin. He was one of the people that I thought did multiple point of view the most effectively, and by which I mean the author for whom I was least tempted to skip POVs when it was someone that I didn't like as much. You know, that feeling of like, oh, now we're in Bran, I couldn't care less, and you start to skim or whatever. And I never really had that with Martin. And so I really studied like, how is he doing this and what is he doing? And two things jumped out to me. One, although everyone is having a character arc, they don't, you can't run their arc at the same speed at the same time. So not everyone can be having their call to adventure at the same time. You must stagger it. Not everyone can be having their darkest, well, you can do the darkest moment at the same time, but it's hard not to make it ridiculous if 3, 4, 5, 6 people are having a crisis one after another. So staggering the arc is important. And then the other thing I really noticed that he did was you get key pieces of information from Jamie's arc at the same in Bran's POV, for example. So you must read everyone, even if it's not your preferred character. So things like that, there were tricks like that of how to run them that I think Martin does really well. Have you what's the most POV you've done in the book, Sarah?
I think 3 so far.
Right, yeah.
4. But yeah, I certainly couldn't do what Martin does, but it's fascinating to see it. And I am sort of like, it is interesting also to do with a series, you can like add points of view. And it gave me somewhat the same feeling of the Vampire Lestat to read, I think it was the 3rd George R. R. Martin book, and be like, Jamie point of view? Are you kidding? Mr. throws them out of the towers?
Yes, exactly that. Exactly that.
All right, I see you, Myra. Shall we do, it's time for Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. I also quickly wanted to say that for anyone who submitted a question in the first 10 minutes, you can feel free to re-add those questions in the Q&A portion. And I can choose a question if that works for both of you.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, since we're on the topic of POVs, someone asked, who was the hardest character POV to write?
In Dark Rise series or ever in my life? Ever in my life was Laurent in Captive Prince because he's so private, and part of the mystery of that character is like, what is he thinking? So it was very hard to write him without exploding that. And I still question mark if I did that effectively, or if I should have included his POV at all. Then in Dark Rise, the hardest POV was Will by far, because especially in book 1, because everything had to be written. There's a scene in this is the first chapter of Dark Rise book 1, but spoiler for Dark Rise book 1, Will cuts the ropes and sabotages a boat or a cargo boat, and all the cargo goes into the water. but the reader can't know that Will is doing it. And so I had to write it in such a way that Will is actually doing it and thinking about doing it, but the reader doesn't grasp that yet. And every line was it's so technical to do, and so much checking with friends, like, does this give it away? Is this too far across the line? And so, yeah, so that was like really, really tough technical challenge. Sarah, what about you? Who's been your hardest?
Oh gosh. Well, yes. I would say, well, maybe it was hard because I was trying to pay out a surprise, but the point of view that was easiest for me was the one everyone thinks is hardest, who is someone somewhat Marius, someone who's antagonistic to the others. And I was like, oh, what a relief. I can go into his point of view. He has no idea what the hell is going on, and the reader knows what's going on. So he can be really funny and he can make all these assumptions while the reader's like, oh no. I, for one, am really glad that you put in Laurent's POV, I have to say. I was actually thinking, because of aforesaid creeping on Holly and CS's interview on Tuesday, you mentioned that James is a people pleaser, and that was a big difference from him and Laurent. And I hadn't thought about that before, and I'm a huge people pleaser, and so it made me love James even more, and love the fact that you'd put in, maybe spoiler for one, the color, the sort of literalization of people pleasing, and I love the way magic illustrates character like that. So I feel like that, alongside POV, that's an amazing thing you do, making magic say, hey, consider this.
Well, I think that's the fun part about magic, is like making it amplify everyone's like weirdest and most interesting parts of their psyche. Yeah, that's when magic has that sort of dark id to it, that's when I enjoy it the most in books.
All right, thank you. I'm going to combine two of the questions for this next one. So, do you already know the ending to the Dark Rise series? And with that, do you know how long the next book is going to take?
Oh,
yes, I already know the ending of the Dark Rise series. So I'm a planner. I plan everything in advance. The books are mapped out to an almost ridiculous degree. And so, yes, I know what's going to happen. Now, all I must do is execute on this plan. And however, I am a slow writer, and in the past, it takes me about 18 months to write a book, and then throw about 6 months of publishing process onto the end of that. So there's no release date set yet for Dark Rise Book 3, but I would expect about the same gap between 1 and 2 as will be between 2 and 3. And if it turns out to be longer, you can know that the book is turning out to be longer and or more complex than I anticipated. So please wait patiently for Book 3.
Consider us perched.
All right. So the next question is about the setting of the book. So why did you choose to set the story in London, specifically in 1821?
I set the story in London because, as I was sort of touching on a little bit earlier, this book really has something to say about those British fantasies of my childhood, and the way that British colonialism is not just British people went to Australia and set up a colony there, but the way that they also colonized our minds and our imaginations. And so that when we imagine fantasy, like very often we're imagining England, like we're imagining castles and walls, and like that's Europe. It's not Australia. We don't have castles. We don't have borders. We're an island nation. We did not even have a medieval period. So the medieval flair of fantasy is a completely incongruous fit to my country. And yet, we imagine in England. And even the names, like I was sort of saying this yesterday, like, all these heroes of these fantasy novels are always called Will, or they're called Harry. And that is also colonialism, because those are British heroes. Like, they're heroic names because of Henry V and William the Conqueror, and like their heroes are your heroes now, and that is how colonialism works. So I really had something to say about that process, and so I must set the book in London, I thought. And then I chose 1820 because it really was just the beginning of empire for England. It was like just, obviously there was an empire already in the Regency period, but we're just before the Victorian era, and that huge spread of pink over the map, that would affect so many, like, millions of lives for so many hundreds of years into the future. And then why 1821 exactly is it was 4 years before trains were invented. And just that was just simply vibes. Like, I just didn't think Dark Rise was a book with a train vibe. So I
didn't want to do the Dracula thing where they're like pouring over the train schedules, being like, this is how we will meet the vampire.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
I wondered if also setting the book in the past made the transition from adult to YA easier for you, because no one's like, Will, go to school.
Yeah, well, the transition from adult to YA was pretty like, it surprised me in a lot of ways. So here's how I imagined it. Like, when I was a young adult, that was the time when books were most alive to me. Like, that was when my loves were at their most extreme, and the books that I read at that time, like probably between like 11 and like 17, were the books that I will remember forever and will always stay with me. And so I was imagining it as like a very idtastic landscape of adolescent emotional extremes, and I thought, like, this is going to be really, like, wonderful to like wallow around in all this feeling. And then I was surprised by a few aspects of YA that are like just technical limits on what you can do. And like, we talked about this with Holly, but one is that, like, the age of the characters, it's like it doesn't affect what they can do right now, but it just means they can't have very intricate, nuanced pasts with one another. They can't have these tangled, complex relationships that I like to write, because they just haven't been alive long enough. And so that was like an interesting limit. And like, the fact that everything that they're seeing for the first time is always new. And so you're just having to write characters be surprised like by things constantly, and they're in a constant state of firsts. And that, again, like, it's hard to write something being new differently each time. It was like a weird technical limit and things. So I just like, I gained a lot of respect for these YA writers that give this sense of limitless literary freedom within their worlds, when actually there are it is a bit of it can be a box at times. How do you find it? You've done adult now as well, right?
Well, it was interesting writing Lonely People because I wasn't sure that it was adult, and I was like, oh, it is. And
No,
sometimes
it's
I
adult.
would feel hemmed in by YA because I would write what I wanted, and people are like, oh, you can't do that. And I'm like, oh, looks like I just did. So I was like, okay, now's my time. But in fact, also writing this, my poor editor has occasionally been like, oh, you can't do that. I'm like, oh, my villainy is ever expanding. It goes over all genres. I cannot stop. I will transgress. So I guess I've just expanded the limits of the forbidden, which has been fun.
Amazing.
Yeah, so speaking of the, expanding the limits, we have a question that is also talking about the time period. So, you mentioned colonialism, you talked about, you said it in 1821 for very specific reasons, but one of the viewers would like to ask, on the topic of queerness, are you thinking of approaching how queer people were treated from a historical perspective, or are you going to make it more queer normative? Do you have any thoughts on that right now?
Yeah, I thought a lot about that, especially because Dark Rise is historical. And when you write historical, there is at least a segment of your audience that wants things to be factual. Like, this is how it really was, and this is how it really happened. I think my sort of like artistic principle, if you want to call it that in general, is that if you're writing realism, then it's very important to show things as they really are and as they really happen. So if I was writing historical realism, I think I would feel a huge moral obligation to show queer oppressions as they in fact were in that time period. But I think, and maybe this just comes out of my own yearnings of never seeing myself on the page when I was growing up, but I think if the purpose of the book is escapism or something other than realism, then I like the idea that, you know, everyone can escape equally. And so, you know, I didn't want I didn't like as a young reader that it was not, people were not allowed to be gay in Game of Thrones, that it was taboo, and that the same oppressions from our real world had just been imported wholesale into the Game of Thrones world. Because there's no reason for that to happen, and it gave me this feeling of like there's no escape from this oppressive force, like even across fantasy worlds, even into my own imagination. And so I really thought a lot about Dark Rise, because it's like, well, it is escapist, but it's also historical. Like, where is the line, and what should I do with the queer rep in that series? And what I came to was, I think actually weirdly through the lens of young adult, which is that like there weren't young adults in 1821. Like that just didn't exist. It was not a category. And when I was reading like all these like diaries of like young people in that era, and they're all like, I'm a man now as I go to work in the mines at age 14. And so you're either a child or you're an adult. And it had that delineation was like, for women, after sex or marriage, you're an adult, and before that you're a child. And for men, it was usually the workforce. And that also happened at an extremely young age. So this weird category of a teenager, just there wasn't. And so I thought, if I'm artificially constructing a teenager that is already so ahistoric, that like I'm already in made up territory. Like this is like a Regency romance where modern feminism gets transported back. And so if I'm going to do something like that, like a fake history like that, then I want it to be more queer normative. And so that is how that is. And like I think like we talked about Rice earlier, and like the freedom that I felt, like the imaginative just relaxation and freedom that I felt when I read her work, which is so queer normative, like I would hope like an aspiration for me as a writer is to create that kind of mental space for a reader as well, where they can just feel like, oh yeah, great, yeah, we're all gay here, that's fine.
I think you do. And escapism, of course, gets such a bad rap. And it's like, well, people are like, well, why do you dream of escape? And you're like, look around you. Why do you dream of prison?
Right, exactly.
And we all had the experience of reading books or watching movies and being like, hey, what if they liked each other? No, but I know they never will in yes. canon, as it were. And having canon now is such a marvelous escape in itself.
Yes, completely agree. That possibility of like, oh, will they? Oh my God, maybe they actually will.
Yeah, and with that, I'll ask the final question. I'm so sorry, there are lots of great questions in the chat, but I can't get to all of them, of course. So, you know, there are lots of questions about characters and how you write them. So specifically, someone has asked, how do you write characters who, as a reader, we first hate, but then totally fall in love with? And they specified like Laurent or James.
Who is hating them? My God. Sorry, I'm a terrible deviant. It's fine.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like when I first, so way back in history, when I first started writing Captive Prince, and I'd never done this before. I was a total noob writer and I didn't know how to do anything. And I wrote a really terrible first draft of Captive Prince where Laurent was actually more likable, or at least Damon liked him more at the beginning. And it just wasn't working. Like I couldn't, it took me ages to figure out why. And it was just like nothing was sparking. Everything was kind of dead on the page or weird. And I realized like, we have to hate him at the beginning, like hate him. The reader and the and Damon especially has to absolutely hate him.
Damon has to.
And yes. And I think actually, oh no, I'll say this first. So Sarah, you were a rare bean, because most of the readers back then, because Captive Prince was serialized on LiveJournal at the beginning. And so I got to see reader reactions live, chapter by chapter, and people did hate Laurent. And they hated him to the extent that they didn't understand that he was going to be the love interest, and they were shipping Damon with the Regent for like the first 6 or 7 chapters of Captive Prince. That is real. That was happening.
Oh my God.
I know. And so And so I was terrified. I was like, oh my God, like, because I was like, okay, they have to hate him. And then it's like, oh my God, they hate him. Like, I was like, what? This is, but I just had to have faith
You
that
simply see
when
someone
they
blonde and
learn-
sarcastic, and I'm like, my love, come here, tell me
Yeah,
about your
and
problems. Oh, he killed
yeah.
your brother. That's so terrible. It's horrible.
But I think like, yeah, well, there's people that will just love villains like yourself, but also people that I guess are like narratively literate enough to understand like this is a form of asshole that we're going to learn has got something more to them.
That's his
And
own
so,
jerks. But of course, also you set up the slow burn so well.
right.
And again in Dark Eyes, and perhaps in the future, new
Well,
project.
I remember you saying to me, and like this has been one of the best pieces of writing advice I've ever heard from anyone, which is like, I'm going to say a worse version of it than probably like you said a perfect version of this, but which was that like you have to leave the reader will fill any empty space that you leave. So if Damon was only hating Laurent, then you're leaving this empty space of liking Laurent, and the reader will be pushed there. Like if it's the same that if you're just telling the reader constantly that a character is so great and wonderful, the reader's going to be like, well, maybe I don't like this character. And so, but in the same way, and you're like, if you're constantly like, this is the most despicable snake, this person is the worst, what a monster, what a horrible, the reader will be like, really? But is it really that bad? Like, and so I ran this play in Captive Prince where Damon was always one step behind, always like the reader. So the reader would see Laurent do a good action, and then Damon would be like, well, that was clearly the worst. And it leaves the reader a space to go, and then they feel like they're learning a secret, or they've got a secret entry into the character. With Dark Rise, it was a little bit harder because like Will does not hate James, and so but
we
other
often
characters
see
do.
James
So
a lot earlier on, and in a
right.
sinister way. So that was like a great function of the multiple POVs that we were like, oh, here's James, he's bad, and again, I loved him right away. Like you had me,
Right,
no problem.
right.
But yeah, you have to structure it in the way of Revelations.
Yeah. And I think if you can pull off that trick, the reader will love a character more if they hated them first, because they feel like they've accessed a secret self or a secret knowledge that not everyone has. And that's a really special feeling and connection. And they've like gone on a journey with the character from hating to love. So I do think that it's worth, for me anyway, from a writing sense, it's worth risking that readers won't like the character at the start, for that greater pleasure of love that they will reach at the end. But the weird thing is, I think I do this with full out books as well, because like very often I'll get feedback of like, oh, I hated this for the first 3/4 and then I just loved everything. And so it's like, yeah, often I do sort of make the reader do something quite arduous before they reach the loving part. So anyway, you just have to earn your pleasures.
I love the way that you invite readers in and create liminal spaces for them and allow them to transgress. As in, some people are like, oh, forbidden romance isn't too bad in the book, and the reader's like, I don't know. But if you're like, no, it's so forbidden, and the reader will be like, I don't know, it could be okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Characters are doorways, stories are doorways, and liminal spaces are by their nature doorways. Princes are doorways because they're in the transition to becoming something else. Heirs are doorways, and I love that you hold the door open for readers, and I think that your readers are very special and they are very willing to go through them with you.
Yes, thank you to all the readers who are willing to go on these difficult journeys with us all together.
Oh, what a lovely way to end the evening. Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you for everyone who joined us from all over everywhere. I know we're all in different time zones. Remember to use the Eventbrite page with which you registered for this event to buy books. We have book plates that will be coming with books, and also exclusive trading cards. So definitely get on that. And we hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you
so
for
much,
chatting
everyone.
with me. Thank you, readers. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of your questions. They were amazing. I just get so excited chatting.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was so lovely to be able to chat with you all. Thank you also to Bookline and to Sarah for the amazing chats today.